Hey everybody, this is Taha. Providing feedback when the user hovers over something is good for the user experience. There are many ways to do this. You can, for example, change the border color of the element, or increase its size, or maybe display some border below it. Or you can even be more creative by showing some floating effect when hovering over it, like this for example. If you are interested in learning how to do this in step-by-step, keep watching. I'm here in an empty project. Let's start by adding an image into the page. So I'm going to say image. Let's use the example image I have, and let's give it a class of floating image. Now let's convert this image into a card. So let's go into styling and say floating image, and let's give it a width of 200 pixels and a height of 200 pixels. Let's give it some nice border of 10 pixels. And let's save. Now let's center this image. Let's start by setting the height of the document to 100%. So let's say root height 100%. Now let's style the body tag like this. Let's set its width to 100%, height 100%. Now to center the content of the body, we will use flexbox. Let's say display flexbox, justify content center, and align items center. And I'll change the background color to some bluish color like this one. So let's say background color and use this one. Next, let's define the hover state for this card. So let's say floating image hover. When I hover over this image, I'm gonna run some animation. So let's use the CSS animation. I'm gonna call this animation float, and its duration would be 2.5 seconds. Let's set the timing function to linear, and let's make it run infinitely using infinite. Now let's define the animation. We're going to define the animation using keyframes. So let's say keyframes, and it will be called float. Now before writing the animation for this element, let's understand something about the transform CSS property. So I set up this example to demonstrate some ideas about the transform CSS property. So this box element has no transform applied to it. If we change the transform to something like translate x with some value, it will move to the right. And if we set the rotate to some value, it would rotate around its center point, like this. So I set rotate to 45 degrees, and it rotated like this. Now, one important thing to understand about the transform CSS property is that when you move an element using the translate x or y, it moves using these axes. Now, initially, it will have this normal x and y axis. So here's the y axis, and here's the x axis. Which means when I want to move it along the x axis, it will use this path. So again, if I set translate x to 400 pixels, it will move to the right like this. Another great thing about the transform CSS property is that you can add more properties to it. So I added translate x of 400 pixels. I can, for example, add a rotation value. For example, if I rotate it with 45 degrees, it will rotate like this, which is something that we all expect. What's interesting about this is that if you rotate it first, then you change the axes of that element. So now the x-axis is heading 45 degrees, and the y-axis is like this, which means if we move it along the x-axis, it will move using this path. So let's now, for example, move it 400 pixels to the right. Now it moves like this. Now what about if we want to keep it in that position, but rotate it back to its original rotation position? We can do that easily by reversing the rotate property like this. A very important thing to understand here is that the order of the CSS properties used here matters. So in this example, I first rotated to 45 degrees, which changed the x and y axis of that element. And then I move it to 400 pixels to the right, and then I rotate it back to its original position. The point here is that if you change the order of these properties, you will end up with a different result. Try this yourself. Now, as you can imagine, we can move the element in circular path if we just keep changing the rotate property of that element. If we change it from 0 degrees to 360 degrees, then it will move in a full circle, like this. Now our floating example, we use the exact same animation, except that the distance between the element and its original position would be smaller. And we can't change that by decreasing this value. So if we set it to something smaller like 10 pixels, it will be like this. Cool, so now we understand how this animation works. Let's get back to our code and apply the same animation to our image element. So let's define the starting point using from. We will animate its transform, so let's say transform. The initial rotation would be 0 degrees, so let's say rotate 0 degrees. Now let's define its distance. This time I'm going to use translate y instead of translate x for a reason you will see in a bit. So let's say translate y and set it to -12 pixels to move it up. And now let's reverse its rotation. In this case it will also be 0 degrees. Now let's define the ending state. Now the ending state for the rotation would be 360 degrees. And the distance would be the same. And let's reverse its rotation by -360 degrees. Now let's test that. Now it works, except that I see a small issue here, which is this jump when I hover over it. Look how it jumps to the top a little bit when I hover over it. Again. Actually, this is expected. It happens because the original translate y of this image is 0. And now when we hover over it, we set it to -12 pixels. We can fix this by setting the initial translate y of this element the same as this one. Let's try that. Let's say transform and translate y -12 pixels. Now that will move it a little bit to the top. And that's why I use translate y instead of translate x, because it makes more sense to push the element a little bit to the top instead of to the left or to the right. Let's now try this. Now the last thing here is to add some shadow when the image is floating. And actually this is an easy thing to do. Now when the image is in the hover state, let's add this box shadow. And to make the animation smoother, let's add some transition for this shadow. The duration would be 0.25 seconds. The timing function would be ease, and it will transition the box shadow property. Now let's test this. That's it. So now that we have defined the float animation, you can easily reuse this on any element you want by setting its class to floating image, or you can rename it whatever you want. I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments. I will see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.